It is late autumn, 1299. The plains outside Delhi are wrapped in a cold that bites through wool and leather alike, a pre-dawn grey that turns every shape into a shadow and every shadow into a threat. The Yamuna River runs dark and silent to the east, its surface barely catching the last stars of a fading night. The air smells of dust and horse, and something else, something older, harder to name. The smell of an army that has been marching for 6 months and has not stopped to plunder a single city along the way. That restraint alone should have terrified everyone. And then the sun begins to rise, and on the horizon, stretching from tree line to tree line across the full width of the plain, a black tide rolls forward. 60,000 Mongol horsemen, sons and grandsons of the men who burned Baghdad, who shattered Persia, who turned the green fields of Kiev and Rus into charnel grounds that took generations to reclaim. They move in disciplined waves, their banners barely visible through the rising dust, their war drums already beginning. A low, rhythmic thunder that has no natural source, that seems to rise from the earth itself rather than from the hands of men. 10 kilometers behind them, the walls of Delhi. Inside those walls, 2 million people who have heard what happens when the Mongols reach a city. Who know the stories, who have spent the last 3 weeks watching refugee families pour through the gates from every village on the northwest frontier, carrying nothing but children and terror. Now, what do? You are Alauddin Khalji. You have been Sultan of Delhi for 3 years. You took that throne through assassination. Your uncle's blood is still, metaphorically, on your hands, and half your court despises you for it. Your most celebrated general is more popular than you are. Your advisors, the wisest men you employ, are in your war council right now telling you to negotiate, to stall, to survive this by not fighting it, and 60,000 Mongols are 10 kilometers from your gates. What do? If you're watching this for the first time, wherever you are right now, drop your location in the comments. I genuinely love knowing where this community reaches. Then stay with me. Because what Alauddin chose to do in the next 48 hours didn't just save Delhi. It didn't just stop an invasion. It broke something fundamental in the Mongol war machine that had never been broken before. Not by any power anywhere on earth. And he did it with a weapon that none of his enemies ever saw. Not one arrow of it, not one soldier of it. A weapon so patient, so systemic, so deeply embedded in the architecture of how he had rebuilt his entire sultanate, that the Mongols walked directly into it and never knew what killed them. Hit that like button if you're already in. Subscribe if you want to stay. And let's go back to 1299. This battle changed the fate of an entire civilization. And almost nobody knows it happened. To understand what happened at Kili, you have to understand what the Mongols had become by 1299, not what they started as, a nomadic confederation from the Mongolian steppe under Genghis Khan, though that origin matters. But what they had evolved into after 70 years of conquest. Geez, because by the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire had fractured into 4 separate khanates, and the one pointed at India, the Chagatai Khanate, controlling the vast Central Asian territories from Transoxiana to the edges of Afghanistan, was in a peculiar and dangerous position. It was hemmed in on every side by its own family. To the north and west sat the Golden Horde. To the east, the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan's heirs. To the south and southwest, the Ilkhanate in Persia. Every direction a Chagatai Khan looked, he saw a cousin with an army. The only direction that offered genuine expansion, real conquest, new territory, new wealth, new glory, was south. Across the Hindu Kush, into the Indian subcontinent, into the domains of the Delhi Sultanate. This had been the logic behind every Mongol incursion into India since the 1220s, when Genghis Khan himself had chased the Khwarezmi prince to the borders of the subcontinent and stopped, surveying the hot plains with something that the chronicles suggest was calculation rather than reluctance. His successors had not been so restrained in their curiosity. The raids came in waves: 1241, 1285, 1292, 1297, 1298, each one probing deeper, each one testing the defences of whoever happened to be sitting on the Delhi throne. And each time, Delhi had managed to push back. Barely, expensively, at tremendous cost in blood and gold. But the ruler of the Chagatai Khanate in 1299 was Dua Khan, a man who had spent 2 decades rebuilding his Khanate's military capacity after a series of internal wars, a man of specific and patient ambition, a man who had watched his predecessors raid and retreat, and concluded that the problem was not Delhi's strength, but Mongol strategy. Previous incursions had been punitive expeditions, raids for loot and terror. Dua Khan wanted something different. He wanted to conquer, to govern, to plant a Mongol dynasty on the banks of the Yamuna, the same way his ancestors had planted one on the banks of the Volga. And so in late 1299, he summoned his son. Kutlugh Khwaja does not enter the historical record the way great generals usually do. Not through a dramatic battlefield debut or a celebrated siege. He enters through a negative, through what he does not do. On the long march south through Punjab, through the fertile river valleys that every previous Mongol commander had stripped bare for supplies and psychological effect, Kutlugh Khwaja issues an order that would have seemed incomprehensible to any army of that era. Do not plunder. Not the villages, not the caravans, not the frontier towns. Let them go. Move past them. Save everything. Every unit of energy, every gram of discipline, every calorie of food. For Delhi. This is the defining trait of Kutlugh Khwaja, visible in that single decision. He is patient in the way that apex predators are patient. He does not snap at distractions. He waits for the thing that matters. The Mongol army that emerges from the Punjab passes like a ghost through territories that expected to be destroyed. Alauddin's frontier generals, stationed at Multan and Samana and Kuram, harassed the column at night, tried to drag Kutlugh Khwaja into engagements that would slow and bleed the force. But he refused every engagement. When Zafar Khan himself, commanding the Delhi garrison at Kuram, sent a messenger challenging Kutlugh Khwaja to single combat, the Mongol prince sent back a reply that was equal parts insult and tactical intelligence. Kings fight kings. Come find me at Delhi. And then Kutlugh Khwaja made his camp at Kili, 10 kilometers from the city's suburbs, close enough that the people of Delhi could see his fires at night. Now, we must talk about Alauddin Khalji. Not his biography. That is a longer and darker story for another day. But who he was in this moment, in the winter of 1299, as 60,000 enemies settled onto the plain outside his capital. Because understanding Alauddin in this crisis requires understanding the specific nature of the danger he was standing in. Danger that came not only from outside the walls, but from inside his own court. He had become Sultan 3 years earlier by orchestrating the assassination of his uncle and predecessor, Alauddin Khalji. This was not a secret. Everybody knew. And in the political culture of the Delhi Sultanate, where legitimacy was constantly contested and power was only ever as secure as the loyalty of your senior commanders, that knowledge made Alauddin perpetually vulnerable. He ruled through a combination of genuine military competence, absolute ruthlessness, and a paranoia so finely tuned it bordered on prescience. So he had spent 3 years systematically removing anyone whose loyalty he questioned, and replacing them with men whose careers depended entirely on him. But there was one exception. One man he had not been able to diminish. Zafar Khan. The previous year, 1298, a Mongol force had invaded the Sultanate and been met at Jalandhar. The battle had been a Delhi victory, and the chronicle accounts are clear about who earned most of the glory. Zafar Khan, commanding the right wing, had led a charge so devastating that it shattered the Mongol centre and turned an engagement into a rout. He came home to celebrations, to poems written in his honour, to a public adoration that Alauddin watched from his throne with eyes that did not join the applause. Alauddin understood, with the cold intelligence that made him both effective and terrifying, that popular generals are either your greatest asset or your greatest threat. Zafar Khan was rapidly becoming the second kind, not through any disloyalty of his own. The chronicles are clear that Zafar Khan served his sultan genuinely, but because the differential in public reputation was becoming dangerous. A kingdom in crisis turns to its heroes, and Alauddin could not afford to be outshone in a crisis. He could not remove Zafar Khan without destroying his own army's morale. He could not promote him to a position of higher command without amplifying the threat. He could not sideline him without losing one of his best weapons in the battle ahead. What Alauddin did instead requires a cold reading, and we will return to it. First, we must understand what was at stake on every level of this confrontation. Because the Battle of Kili was not merely a military engagement between two armies. It was not even simply a struggle for political survival. It was something older and more final. Consider what the Mongols had done to every major civilization that stood in their path. Baghdad, the center of Islamic learning, the Abbasid Caliphate, the intellectual heart of the Muslim world, had been sacked in 1258 with a thoroughness that the chronicles describe in terms of astronomical horror. The Grand Library burned for days. The canals ran black with ink. The caliph was wrapped in carpets and trampled by horses. The Mongol method for executing royalty, which held that royal blood must not touch the earth. In the space of 2 weeks, a civilization that had accumulated for 5 centuries was dismantled. Persia, Khorasan, the Fergana Valley, Central Asian cities that had been among the most sophisticated urban centers on earth. The pattern repeated everywhere, not merely conquest, erasure. And now that same force, disciplined, focused, led by a commander who had shown the patience to restrain it through 6 months of temptation, was parked 10 kilometers from Delhi. From the mosques and markets and libraries and workshops and millions of lives that constituted the beating heart of the last major Islamic power in the East. If Delhi fell, there was nothing behind it. No wall, no army, no civilization with the capacity to stop the tide from reaching the ocean. This is what Alauddin Khalji carried with him into his war council. Why, and this is what was actually on the table when his uncle Alaul Mulk, the Kotwal of Delhi, the wisest and most trusted advisor he had, spread his hands and said, "We cannot win this fight. Let us negotiate. Let us buy time. Let us survive." The room was quiet. Every general present understood the logic. 60,000 Mongols. An army assembled for conquest, not raid. A commander who had marched 6 months without breaking discipline. What could be said against that arithmetic? Alauddin looked around the room, and then he did what cold men do when they see clearly and others see only the fear. He calculated, not the odds of the battle, the odds of what came after. If he negotiated now, what message did that send to every regional governor, every ambitious noble? Every frontier commander watching to see whether the usurper sultan had the nerve to hold his throne in a real crisis. Weakness, once demonstrated, compounds. The Mongols might be bought off this year, but they would return knowing the price. And every enemy inside the Sultanate would have seen Alauddin blink. He stood up from the council table. He summoned Alaul Mulk forward, and he handed him the keys to the palace. "Stay here," he said. "Guard the city. And when the battle is over, give these keys to whoever wins it." He left the room without looking back. The plain of Kili sits roughly 10 kilometers north of where Delhi's medieval suburbs ended and the open land began. Look at it on a map, and what strikes you immediately is how constrained it is. Not the endless open steppe that Mongol cavalry doctrine required. See, not the wide, flat killing ground where a feigned retreat could stretch over miles before the encirclement snapped shut. The Yamuna River runs along the eastern flank, a natural hard boundary that limits how far any army can extend its right side. To the west, broken bushland and scrub terrain interrupts the kind of sweeping cavalry arcs that Mongol commanders use the way a craftsman uses a favourite tool. And between those two constraints, the plain itself is perhaps wide enough for a large army to deploy, but not wide enough to manoeuvre freely, not at the scale Kutlug Khwaja had brought. This ground did not choose itself. Alauddin Khalji chose it. He had positioned his camp near Siri, on the Yamuna's banks, before marching to Kili. The choice of staging ground tells you everything about his thinking. The river was not behind his army by accident. It was behind his army by design, a barrier that prevented the kind of catastrophic rout that had destroyed so many forces before him, the collapse of a line where a retreat becomes a stampede and a stampede becomes a massacre. His soldiers knew the river was there. They knew they could not run. Whether that knowledge was meant to fortify their resolve or simply to remove the option of cowardice is a question the chronicles do not answer. But Alauddin would have understood that sometimes those two things are the same. The bushland to the west served a different function. Mongol cavalry charges depend on space. They depend on the ability to swing wide, to find the seam between units, to pour through gaps like water finding cracks in stone. Broken terrain eliminates that option. It forces horsemen to fight as if they were infantry, slower, denser, more vulnerable to the kind of sustained, close-range combat that steppe warriors train least for. Alauddin was not just choosing a place to stand and fight, he was choosing a place that turned Mongol advantages into disadvantages before a single weapon was raised. The Delhi army that assembled on that plain in late 1299 was, by any honest accounting, a remarkable force, not for its size, though it was large, but for its composition and the specific ways it had been reformed in the years since Alauddin took the throne. The chronicler Firishta, writing 2 centuries later with numbers inflated by the inevitable hyperbole of court historians, recorded 300,000 horses and 2,700 elephants. Modern historians, in working from logistics and the physical constraints of supply lines, arrive at figures closer to 70,000 troops and 700 war elephants, still an enormous force, still a force that had required years of structural reform to build, train, and sustain. At the core of that army were the Turkish Mamluk cavalry, slave soldiers, technically, in the tradition of Islamic military culture that had produced some of the finest fighting forces the medieval world ever saw. Men purchased young, trained exclusively in war, belonging by law to the Sultan alone rather than to any local noble or faction. Their loyalty was structural. Their discipline was the product of professional military education rather than the variable motivation of feudal obligation. On horseback, with composite bows or curved swords, meet in the tight formations that close-order cavalry required, they were the best heavy cavalry available in the Sultanate, and they were numerically Alauddin's largest single class of warrior. Behind and alongside the Mamluk cavalry stood the Rajput infantry. These were warriors of a fundamentally different tradition, Hindu soldiers from the martial communities of Rajputana, men raised inside a warrior culture that treated combat as something close to religious practice, whose code demanded that they fight without retreat and die without surrender. Where the Mamluk cavalry provided disciplined mobile firepower, the Rajput infantry provided something equally critical: human mass, shock resistance, the ability to hold ground in close quarters combat when horses could no longer function and the battle reduced to steel and muscle and will. So Zafar Khan commanded these elements on the right wing, and the relationship between that general and his Rajput troops was the relationship of a man to tools he had spent years learning to use perfectly. And then there were the elephants. Approximately 700 of them, by the more conservative estimates. Each one armoured, thick quilted padding, reinforced with metal plates across the forehead and flanks, protection against arrow shafts that would be meaningless against a charge, but which added to the visual enormity of the animals. The tusks of many were fitted with iron blades or heavy metal caps, turning the elephant's natural weapons into something purpose-built for combat. And positioned ahead of the cavalry lines in screens of 22 per division, they served a function that no human soldier could replicate. Mongol cavalry was the most mobile, most precisely controlled, most tactically sophisticated heavy horse force in the medieval world. It had absorbed the military traditions of a dozen conquered civilizations and refined them into something that had broken every army it faced on open ground. But it rested on one physical fact, the horse. And the horse, however trained, however brave its rider, had never evolved alongside animals of the elephant's size and smell. The Mongol ponies that approached an elephant screen did not simply slow down. They refused, they shied, they screamed. The most precisely trained cavalry in the world became, in the presence of armoured war elephants at close range, a problem of animal psychology that no amount of human discipline fully solved. Alauddin understood this. He had placed the elephant screen not as a last resort, not as a reserve to be committed when things went badly, but as the first thing the Mongols would encounter. The first thing their horses would smell. The first thing that would begin to erode the confidence of men who had never been stopped before. His intelligence apparatus had been active long before the Mongols crossed the Indus. The system Alauddin had built, the Barids, official couriers who carried military intelligence along a network of relay stations, and the Munhis, covert informants embedded in frontier towns and among the merchant caravans that Mongol scouts interrogated for information, had been tracking Kutluk Khwaja's force from the moment it entered the Punjab. Alauddin knew the approximate size of the army. He knew its route. He knew its division structure. And he knew that Kutluk Khwaja had not looted a single village, which told him something critical about the mindset of the commander he faced. This was a man who would not be distracted, who had come for a specific target and had subordinated everything else to reaching it. This knowledge did not make Alauddin unafraid, but it allowed him to be afraid of the right things. And a man who knows precisely what he faces can prepare precisely for it, rather than spending his preparation time on the wrong threats. The Darg system, the branding and registration of cavalry horses, had been one of Alauddin's first military reforms after taking the throne, and it matters here in ways that are easy to overlook. Before Alauddin, the Delhi army was a feudal force. Nobles brought their retinues. Those retinues were of uncertain quality. Horses were borrowed or substituted or quietly sold and replaced with inferior animals, and no one in the central command had a reliable accounting of actual combat strength at any given moment. The Dar reform changed that. Every horse in the army was physically inspected, described and registered. Every soldier's mount was branded. Muster reviews were conducted regularly. The gap between paper strength and actual strength, the gap that had destroyed armies throughout history, because commanders planned for what they thought they had rather than what they actually had, was closed. When Alauddin marched to Kili, he knew his numbers. He knew his horses. He knew his elephants. He knew the physical condition and combat history of every major unit under his command. In an era of chronic military uncertainty, that knowledge was a weapon as real as any sword. The night before the battle settled over the plain of Kili like a held breath. In the Delhi camp, the fires burned in careful rows, and the sounds of tens of thousands of men preparing themselves for the possibility of death created a particular kind of noise, low, constant, irreducible. Somewhere near the elephant lines, where the animals shifted and breathed in the dark, an infantryman sat cross-legged on cold ground and cleaned a sword that did not need cleaning. He was not a general. He was not named in any chronicle. He was one of the anonymous thousands who appear in history only as a number in a casualty count or as a vague collective noun. The army, the forces, the men, His hands moved over the blade in the way hands move when they need to do something because stillness is unbearable. He could smell the elephants. He could hear the prayers, Arabic from the Mamluk tents, Persian from the court soldiers, Sanskrit whispered by the Rajputs in patterns as old as the hills their grandfathers had defended. All of it rising into the same cold night sky. Whatever gods were listening that night received petitions in at least 3 languages. Across the plain, the Mongol fires burned in their thousands. Seen from a distance, from the walls of Delhi, where watchers stood in silence, the effect was of a second city, a city of light and discipline, its perimeter defined, its watches regular, its organization visible even at this distance. It was the organization that frightened people most, chaos they could process. This patient, methodical luminescence on the horizon was something harder to face. In his tent, Kutluk Khwaja had done something remarkable that evening. He had sent 4 envoys to Alauddin's camp, not negotiators, not peace emissaries, something stranger. He had asked Alauddin to allow these 4 men to walk the full perimeter of the Delhi army, to look at every division, to ask the names of every senior officer. A display of confidence so theatrical it was almost a provocation. I am so certain of victory that I am willing to let you show me everything you have. Alauddin had granted the request. The envoys walked the camp. They looked, they asked, they were answered, politely, completely. And then they went back to report to Kutluk Khwaja. What neither the envoys nor their prince knew was that Alauddin's intelligence men were watching every step those envoys took, noting which formations they lingered over, noting which officers they specifically asked about, noting the questions behind the questions. Alauddin did not just grant the envoys access, he used the access against them. By the time those 4 men returned to the Mongol camp, Alauddin likely knew more about Kutluk Khwaja's tactical priorities than the Mongol prince had intended to reveal. The war council that convened in Alauddin's command tent in the small hours before dawn was brief and very quiet. The formation was as he had designed it, his own division at the centre, the largest and most heavily armoured concentration of men and elephants. Zafar Khan commanding the right wing, with the Rajput infantry and cavalry that were his natural complement. Ulugh Khan, Alauddin's brother, loyal in the absolute way that men are loyal when their own fate is inseparable from their commanders, on the left. 2 flanking reserve wings to stiffen the line if the centre buckled. And then the order, the one that every officer in that tent had been expecting and still received in silence. No movement without direct command from me. No officer leaves his position, no attack, no pursuit, no response to any action by the enemy without my authorization. The punishment for violation was not demotion, not censure, not public humiliation, execution. Every general present understood what the order was really about. It was about Zafar Khan. Everyone in that tent knew about Zafar Khan's temperament, about his fury from the Yamuna defeat, about the way he held grudges with both hands, about what a man like that would do when he saw the enemy that had humiliated him standing within charging range. Zafar Khan sat with his hands flat on his knees and said nothing. Outside the tent, the fog was lifting. The plain of Kili emerged from grey into the pale gold of an early winter dawn. Somewhere on that plain, 60,000 men were completing their own preparations. The drums were already beginning. Distant, then closer, then impossible to hear over. Silence, then drums. The sound hit first, not the visual. The visual came in pieces, obscured by the morning dust that 60,000 moving horses kicked into the cold air until the whole horizon disappeared behind a brown haze. But the sound arrived whole and immediate. The Mongol war drums in massed formation created a vibration that was less a noise than a physical condition, something felt in the sternum and the back teeth and the soles of the feet through the ground itself. Alongside the drums, the war cries, a rolling, layered sound in half a dozen Central Asian languages and dialects, the collective voice of an army that had been raised to believe it could not lose. And under all of that, constant and hypnotic, the thunder of hooves on the packed winter earth of the Kili plain. The Delhi soldiers on the front lines heard all of this before they could see any of it. The men stationed near the elephant lines felt the great animals shift and trumpet, a sound that is somehow both biological and mechanical. Unlike anything a human throat produces, carrying across the plain in a register that the Mongol horses on the far side could hear clearly. The elephants knew. Animals always know before the humans do. The smell arrived with the visual, wave after wave of it, horse sweat and leather, and the particular sharp smell of an army that has been moving hard for 6 months, overlaid with dust so thick it coated the lips and the back of the throat. Men wiped their eyes. Men who had trained for years, for this exact moment, discovered that training does not prepare you for the scale of the thing itself. When 60,000 men move toward you, the mathematics of it, the sheer physical fact of 60,000 bodies in motion, of 60,000 weapons levelled in your direction, does something to the nervous system that cannot be rehearsed. But Alauddin's line held. This was not an accident. This was the product of the standing army reform, of years of regular pay that replaced the unreliable motivation of feudal obligation with something more durable, professionalism. These were soldiers whose entire identity was military, whose careers and families and futures depended on the continuation of the Sultan's authority. They had been trained to hold. They had been told to hold. And the elephant screen in front of them, those enormous, armoured, magnificently indifferent animals facing the Mongol advance with tusks glinting in the winter sun, gave them something concrete to stand behind. The Mongol composite bows opened the engagement from range. This was standard doctrine. Soften the target before the charge. Thin the front ranks, create panic and disorder before the cavalry arrived to exploit it. The arrows came in volleys, not individually, the sound of them a collective whisper that accelerated to a roar. They found gaps in armour. They found unprotected horses. They found the occasional gap in the elephant padding where a lucky shaft could bury itself in thick grey hide. But the elephants did not run from arrows. They had been trained since birth to stand fire. And a Mongol horse, trained since birth to follow commands and respond to the knee pressure of a skilled rider, has no training for the smell of a 7-ton animal directly in its path. As the morning sun cleared the tree line, the first Mongol cavalry charge reached the elephant screen and did not go through it. Horses shied, horses screamed, horses wheeled away from the line of impact despite the desperate urging of their riders, in creating disorder in the Mongol formations that worked back through the line like a wave. The perfectly coordinated advance, the trademark Mongol approach that had destroyed armies on 3 continents, stuttered. But the Mongols did not break. Kutlug Khwaja had expected resistance. He had planned for resistance. The initial charge was probe, not commitment, designed to test, to find weak points, to identify the seam in Alauddin's formation where the next wave could be directed. The Mongol army reorganized with the practiced efficiency of a force that had been trained to adapt, and the probes continued. Here against the right wing, there against the left, testing the depth and resolve of each division in turn. And Delhi answered each test. The Mamluk cavalry traded arrow volleys with Mongol horse archers at ranges where neither side held a clear advantage. The Rajput infantry on the right wing stood in close formation with spears levelled, absorbing the psychological pressure of cavalry approaching and veering away and approaching again. The elephant screen held the centre, and Alauddin, from his command position behind the main line, watched everything and moved nothing. The first hours of the Battle of Kili were not the collision of unstoppable force against immovable object that the chronicles would later dramatise. They were something more procedural and more terrible. Two armies at the extreme edge of each other's effective range, testing and measuring, each waiting for the other to commit in a way that could be exploited. The Mongol left wing was commanded by a general named Hijlak. He was not Kutlug Khwaja's best commander. The prince kept his elite units at the centre and his most reliable veterans opposite Alauddin's main position. Hijlak commanded a division that was strong, but not the Mongol army's sharpest edge, and in the mid-morning assessment of the battle's opening phases, he made a decision that would determine the outcome of the entire engagement. He sent a probe at Delhi's right wing. Not a full attack. A probe, a few thousand horsemen swinging towards Zafar Khan's position, arrows flying, screaming war cries, designed to test the depth of the right wing's commitment, and perhaps create an opening that Kutlug Khwaja's centre could exploit. Standard Mongol tactics, perfectly orthodox, perfectly expected. Zafar Khan had been waiting since the battle started, since before the battle started. He had been waiting since the Yamuna River, where a Mongol force had met him and driven his unit back to Delhi's walls in defeat, where the humiliation had settled into him like a splinter, too deep to remove without surgery, burning with every move. He watched Hijlak's probe come toward his line. He watched the arrows descend into his men. He watched the Mongol horses wheel and scream and turn and come again. He was done waiting. He did not send a messenger to Alauddin. The order, no movement without my command, was fresh in every general's mind from 6 hours ago. Zafar Khan knew the order. He knew the penalty. He raised his sword anyway. And the right wing of the Delhi army, trained to follow that sword, surged forward. What happened in the next hour was devastating. Zafar Khan's charge hit Hijlak's division before it could complete its wheel, catching the Mongol left wing in the worst possible configuration, partially turned, spread for manoeuvre rather than concentrated for reception of a charge. The impact was catastrophic. The Rajput infantry came screaming into contact alongside the Mamluk cavalry, and Hijlak's division simply disintegrated. Not a tactical withdrawal, not an ordered falling back, but a genuine rout. The entire Mongol left wing fragmenting and fleeing across the plain with Zafar Khan behind them. By mid-morning, the dust of Zafar Khan's charge had swallowed the left horizon. From Alauddin's command position, the right wing had simply vanished into its own cloud of destruction. And the reports coming back were extraordinary. That the Mongol left was broken, the Mongol left was fleeing, Zafar Khan was pursuing hard. Zafar Khan was 18 kos deep into Mongol-controlled territory and still going. 18 kos, nearly 60 kilometers. Zafar Khan had not just broken Hijlak's division, he had chased the pieces of it deep into the Mongol rear, far enough that he was now surrounded on 3 sides by Mongol forces that had watched the rout and had time to reform and think about what to do about it. Now we must sit with what Alauddin did next, or rather, what he did not do. He did not order the centre to advance. He did not send a cavalry detachment to support Zafar Khan. He did not open the left wing to swing around and create a second pressure point that might have pulled Mongol units away from the developing trap around his right. He watched. He held the line. He waited. Some historians have argued that Alauddin lacked the real-time information to understand what was happening to Zafar Khan's force at that distance. The dust was thick. Communication in a medieval battle was fundamentally primitive. A man on a horse carrying a verbal message, arriving minutes late with information that was already obsolete. Perhaps Alauddin did not know how deep Zafar Khan had gone. Perhaps he did not understand the scale of the isolation developing around his right wing. But the chronicles tell a different story. They tell us that reports did reach Alauddin. They tell us that he understood Zafar Khan was isolated. And they tell us that he made a choice. The nature of that choice is one of the most uncomfortable facts in this battle's history, and we will not look away from it. But the Mongols were already moving. Kutluk Khwaja, watching Hijlak's rout and tracking Zafar Khan's pursuit, recognized the opportunity with the clarity of a commander trained for exactly this moment. His army was being pulled apart, the left wing gone, the pursuing Delhi force extended and isolated. He had a simple task: close the encirclement before Zafar Khan could extract. The Mongol units that had been holding formation in the centre and right began to swing in a wide arc, cutting off the pursuit route. It took time. Time measured not in minutes, but in the slow pivot of thousands of horsemen across miles of dusty plain. But it happened. And by the time Zafar Khan had run out of enemy to chase and turned back toward Delhi, the arc was complete. The silence that fell when Zafar Khan's force stopped was the kind that has no natural explanation. The dust was still thick. The drums were still going somewhere in the middle distance. But around Zafar Khan's position, surrounded on three sides by regrouped Mongol cavalry, something like quiet descended. The particular quiet of a trap that has closed and knows it has closed. The numbers against him were overwhelming. His detachment, however many thousands had followed him into the charge and survived the pursuit, now faced the concentrated attention of units that had not been committed in the opening phases, units that had been held back precisely for a moment like this. The classic Mongol encirclement, not a wall, but a closing ring, tightening incrementally, making the perimeter smaller and smaller until the force inside had nowhere to move without moving toward the enemy. Zafar Khan did not stop fighting. He turned what had been a pursuit into a last stand with a fluency that only men who have been trained to die well can manage. The Rajput infantry, whose entire martial tradition prepared them for exactly this, surrounded, committed, with no retreat possible and no honourable option except through the enemy, formed up around the cavalry remnants and fought. The chronicles record that Zafar Khan's force inflicted casualties on the Mongols that surprised everyone who witnessed it, including Kutluk Khwaja himself. This was not a massacre of a disorganized rout. This was men dying on their own terms. The Kutluk Khwaja rode close enough to the fighting to see the Delhi general clearly. What he saw was apparently extraordinary enough that he stopped the general press of the encirclement and did something that had no tactical logic whatsoever. He offered terms. Not surrender exactly, and something more than that. He told Zafar Khan that he recognized his quality, that a man like this should not die here, in a ditch, fighting for a sultan who had not sent a single soldier to support him. He offered Zafar Khan the sultanate itself, not as a vassal of the Mongols, but as a ruler. Come over, fight with us. Take Delhi as your own. Zafar Khan's answer came in the form of a charge, but that charge, which was the last act of the most militarily gifted man in the Delhi Sultanate, carried an unintended consequence. In the violent, close-quarters melee that followed, horses and infantry and elephants and men pressed into a space too small for any of them. A Mongol weapon found its mark. Not Zafar Khan's. The chronicles are not completely clear on whether it was a lance, an arrow, or the chaos of a mounted collision. But Kutluk Khwaja took a wound, deep enough to matter, deep enough that his commanders immediately began moving him back from the fighting, away from the field. He died fighting. The words cannot be made smaller than they are. Zafar Khan was cut down in that press of bodies, surrounded, abandoned, fighting anyway. The man who had been the greatest military hero in the Delhi Sultanate, who had shattered a Mongol army at Jalandhar just 1 year before, who had broken Hajlak's entire division with one unauthorized charge, who had been offered a throne and refused it, died in a ditch outside Delhi with no support and no monument, and no eulogy from the Sultan he served. As the sun reached its apex, and the shadows shortened to nothing across the blood-darkened plain, the news moved in 2 directions simultaneously. Toward Alauddin's centre, Zafar Khan is dead. Toward the Mongol army, the prince is gravely wounded. These 2 facts had opposite effects on opposite armies. In Delhi's main line, the death of Zafar Khan did not create the collapse that a military command losing its most aggressive general might have produced. Because Alauddin's line had not moved. The centre was intact, the left wing under Ulugh Khan was intact. The elephant screen was still performing the function it had been designed to perform. The battle, on Delhi's side, was still exactly the battle Alauddin had designed. The right wing had been lost. Zafar Khan had been lost. But the system had not been lost. The Mongol army, which had just encircled and destroyed the Delhi right wing, which had just accomplished the most significant tactical success of the engagement, now had a commander who was being carried from the field, pale and barely conscious, passing commands through intermediaries who understood the orders, but could not convey the judgment of the man who issued them. Something shifts in an army before it knows it has shifted. It is not visible from a distance. From Alauddin's command position, the Mongol formation still looked intact, still appeared disciplined, still held the configuration of an army that had just won a significant tactical engagement. The centre was still strong. See, the reserves that had been committed to the encirclement of Zafar Khan were reforming. The drums were still going. Nothing about the external appearance of the Mongol force suggested anything had changed. But inside that formation, at the level of division commanders and unit captains, and senior advisors who had spent their careers learning to read what the prince's face told them, something was wrong. The commands coming back from where Kutlugh Khwaja was being carried were coherent but delayed, passed through layers of intermediary that introduced hesitation at every level. A Mongol army operating at peak function is a machine of precise, delegated authority, where each commander knows exactly what to do without needing to consult a superior, but that delegation rests on the assumption that the supreme commander is available to resolve ambiguities. When the supreme commander disappears from the chain, those ambiguities accumulate. The attack on Alauddin's centre had been continuing through the afternoon, pressed by Mongol units that had not been committed to the Zafar Khan encirclement. And here is where the elephant screen and the terrain choice, and the standing army reforms, and the intelligence preparation all converged on a single tactical moment. The Delhi centre held, not comfortably, not easily. The casualty records from the main line reflect serious fighting. But it held. The elephants held their position. The Mamluk cavalry held their formation. Alauddin's personal division, the most heavily armoured and best-equipped concentration in the entire Delhi force, did not break. By mid-afternoon, the Mongol army had destroyed Zafar Khan's detachment, wounded its own commander, failed to penetrate the Delhi centre, and was operating without the clear top-level command that Kutlugh Khwaja had provided. The tactical victory of the morning was beginning to feel less decisive than it had seemed. A force of 60,000, committed to a 6-month campaign with an explicit objective of conquest, had reached that objective and found it would not fall. Alauddin watched the Mongol formations begin to slow. He was not a demonstrative man. The chronicles do not record what he said or showed in this moment. But he had been in his command position for the entire engagement, watching everything, committing nothing, waiting for exactly this, For the moment when the Mongol initiative ran into the wall he had spent 3 years building, but he still did not order a general advance. This is the decision that separates careful generalship from recklessness. The Mongol army was not broken. It was still enormous, still capable, still full of veterans who would have loved nothing more than a charging Delhi centre that they could feign retreat and encircle. Alauddin had spent 3 years building an army and a system. He was not going to risk it all on the kind of aggressive pursuit that had just destroyed Zafar Khan. He tightened his grip instead. He kept his men in formation. He made the Mongols feel the weight of a solid, unbroken line that would not be drawn forward. As the winter sun descended toward the western scrubland, the Mongol drums began to change rhythm, slower, lower. The kind of change that, in Mongol military tradition, signalled a shift from assault cadence to withdrawal cadence. They were going back to camp. That night in the Mongol camp there was no celebration. This is the detail that tells you everything. An army that has just won a significant engagement, that has just encircled and destroyed a major Delhi force, that has just demonstrated the validity of its tactical doctrine against the best opposition the Sultanate could field, should be loud that night, should be feeding success with fire and song, and the kind of noise that carries across a plain to the ears of the enemy and tells them what is coming tomorrow. The Mongol camp was quiet. Kutlugh Khwaja was alive, but his commanders knew what a wound like his meant on a 6-month campaign in hostile territory without the medical infrastructure of a permanent base. Even if he survived, and the chronicles strongly suggest his advisers already understood he would not, the march home through Punjab, through the territories that Alauddin's frontier generals were waiting to harass at every crossing, was the march of an army without its head. The arithmetic that had looked so favourable at dawn now looked different. 30 kilometres of enemy territory in every direction. A supply line that stretched back 6 months' march. A prince who was dying, and a Delhi Sultanate that had taken everything the Mongol army had given it for a full day and had not broken. The casualties from Zafar Khan's final stand were being counted. The Mongol chronicler Barani, who was not a propagandist for Delhi, who had no particular reason to inflate the Mongol losses, wrote that a large number of Mongols were killed in the fighting around Zafar Khan's encirclement. Modern historians working from the battle's dynamics suggest that proportionally the Mongol losses in that engagement were heavy relative to their total force, because Zafar Khan's detachment had been fighting back hard even while being surrounded, and because the terrain had denied the Mongols the clean, efficient encirclement they preferred. Somewhere in the cold dark of that second night, the decision was made. Dawn of the second day broke over a Mongol camp that was moving, not toward Delhi, north. The banners came down, the tents came down. The 60,000 horses that had arrived on this plain as the vanguard of a conquest turned their heads away from the city they had come to take and began the long process of becoming a retreating army, which is, in its own way, as organised a thing as an advancing army, but carrying a different weight in every saddle. Alauddin watched from the walls of Siri. He did not cheer. The chronicles do not record cheering anywhere in Delhi that morning. Or, if there was cheering, it was quickly replaced by the silence of people who have survived, something they did not fully expect to survive and are not yet sure how to feel about it. He did not order a general pursuit. He sent light cavalry after the retreating force at a distance, harassment rather than pressure. It is enough to slow and trouble, but not enough to commit his main army to a chase that could go wrong. The final image of the Battle of Kili is the Mongol army on the road north. 60,000 men who had marched 6 months to conquer an empire, moving back through their own footprints in the dust. They carried their dead. They carried their prince. They left behind abandoned equipment, dead horses, the detritus of a force that had believed, entirely reasonably given all previous evidence, that it could not be stopped. They were wrong. The counting of the dead began before the dust had settled. On the Delhi side, the casualties were concentrated almost entirely in Zafar Khan's detachment. The chronicles are not precise enough to give a reliable number for what was lost in that encirclement. The word thousands appears in multiple sources, and modern historians working from the battle's dynamics estimate that the right wing suffered the near-total destruction that an isolated force fighting a prolonged encirclement against overwhelming numbers would be expected to produce. The Rajput infantry in particular, whose warrior code demanded that they not retreat, had fought until there was nothing left to fight with. They died in the same configuration they had charged in, which is itself a kind of testament. The Mamluk cavalry and the main line under Alauddin and Ulugh Khan also took casualties from the Mongol attacks on the centre. The hours of sustained arrow exchange and probing assaults on the Delhi main force were not bloodless, but the main force had held, which meant the main force had survived largely intact, and surviving intact. And in a medieval battle, where a retreat could double your casualties in the rout, was itself a form of victory. On the Mongol side, the chronicler Barani's account, written within living memory of the events, based on sources who had direct access to the aftermath, records something specific and significant. The Mongol casualties were proportionally heavy, not just in the attack on Zafar Khan's encirclement, where Delhi's right wing had exacted a severe price for its own destruction, but in the accumulated cost of a full day of combat against a prepared defensive position with elephant screens and disciplined infantry. The Mongols had won the tactical engagement with Zafar Khan, but winning that engagement had cost them more than they had expected, and it had cost them their prince. Kutlugh Khwaja, the son of Dua Khan, he's a descendant of Genghis Khan, the man who had marched 6 months from Central Asia without plundering a village, who had displayed the disciplined patience of a born commander, who had offered a great enemy general the chance to live and been refused, died somewhere on the road north through the Punjab. The exact location is not recorded. The exact date is not recorded. The chronicles note only that he was mortally wounded in the fighting at Kili and did not survive the journey home. His father received a body and a failed conquest. The Mongol army that returned to the Chagatai Khanate carried its prince's death and its empty hands. No conquered territory, no Delhi treasury, no report to Dua Khan of a sultanate broken and ready to be governed. Just the road home, and the counting of what had been lost. The plain of Kili. We, as the second day's light faded, was a geography of aftermath. Where the morning had been dust and drums and motion, the evening was stillness, the specific stillness of ground that has absorbed violence and is now in the process of returning to being ground. Abandoned Mongol lances stood at angles in the soil, too numerous to have been collected. Dead horses lay in the particular sprawled poses of large animals that have run out of life, their weight settling into the earth. Crows had arrived before the human scavengers, moving with the efficient purposelessness of birds who have learned what battlefields mean. The Yamuna flowed past the eastern edge of what had happened, carrying its own business south toward the sea, indifferent. In the city of Delhi, the sound of the returning army reached the streets before the army itself did. Watchers on the walls had been relaying information since the Mongol camp began moving, and by the time Alauddin's forces entered the city gates, the news had already moved through the crowded, refugee-filled streets that had spent weeks choking on their own fear. The markets that Alauddin's price controls had kept from complete collapse began the slow process of normalization. The caravans that had been halted by the Mongol encampment began moving again. The people who had fled from the northwest frontier villages began slowly the process of considering whether to go back. But Alauddin entered Delhi to a silence that was more complicated than celebration. In the throne room, before the assembled court, before the generals who had survived and the families of those who had not, Alauddin made his position on Zafar Khan explicit. The dead man had disobeyed a direct royal order. He had broken the chain of command at the most critical moment of the engagement. He had taken his division into a position of isolation that had resulted in its destruction. The fact that he had fought magnificently in that isolation had inflicted severe casualties on the encircling force, had refused a personal offer of terms from the Mongol prince himself, had died with his sword in his hand rather than surrendering. None of this was addressed in Alauddin's public statement. The court understood what was not being said as clearly as what was. No one in that room praised Zafar Khan, not one voice. The men who had served alongside him, who had watched him train for years, who had seen what he did on that plain, sat with their mouths shut and their eyes forward and said nothing. Because what Alauddin was demonstrating in that silence was the same thing he had demonstrated in the battle itself: control. Total, cold, absolute control of the environment around him. A sultan who could watch his most celebrated general die without sending support, and who could then stand before the court and define that death as insubordination rather than sacrifice, was a sultan who had just made it completely clear to every man in the room that there was no limit to what he would subordinate to the requirements of his authority. This too was a weapon, and it too had been built long before the battle. But Dua Khan did not stop. This matters. The lesson that some historians draw from Kili, that it ended Mongol ambitions toward India, is not quite right, and the reality is in some ways more impressive than the simplified version. So Dua Khan, back in his Khanate, absorbing the news of his son's death and his army's failure, did not interpret the result as a definitive statement about the impossibility of conquering Delhi. He interpreted it as an operational failure that required a different approach. He sent another army in 1303. This one reached the walls of Delhi itself, not a camp 10 kilometers out, but the actual perimeter of the city, and laid siege to it. Alauddin had been campaigning in Rajputana when the invasion came. He rushed back. He took shelter in Siri Fort, the same fort he had begun building after Kili, for exactly this contingency. The Mongols surrounded the fort. They could not breach it. They plundered the suburbs. They burned what was burnable. After 2 months, they left. The fort held, because Alauddin had built the fort, because the food stockpiles inside the fort had been sufficient for an extended siege, because the garrison had been maintained at full strength through the standing army system, because every decision Alauddin had made in the years between 1299 and 1303 had been aimed in part at surviving exactly this scenario, then 1305, then 1306. Each time, a different Mongol army, a different approach, a different commander. Each time the same result. Delhi did not fall. And in 1306, the Delhi forces, by now battle-hardened against a decade of Mongol pressure, confident in their doctrine, expert in their enemy's tactics, did not just defend, they counter-attacked. They drove the Mongol force back across the Ravi River and kept going, raiding into what are now the territories of Afghanistan, plundering Mongol-controlled settlements, who carrying the war back to its source. The Chagatai Khanate never invaded India again. Not because they decided Delhi wasn't worth taking, but because they couldn't figure out how to take it. The immediate consequence of Kili was not what most people expect when they hear the word victory. Delhi was not saved in some final, conclusive sense on that winter day in 1299. The Mongols would come again 3 more times in Alauddin's reign, and the city would face a direct siege 4 years later. What Kili actually produced in its immediate aftermath was something more subtle and more durable than a clean victory. It produced proof. Proof that a specific system, the intelligence network, the standing army, the terrain-based defensive doctrine, the elephant screens, through the price stabilization that kept Delhi's population functional under pressure, could absorb a Mongol assault and remain intact. Proof that the system worked, and in politics and military history, proof that something works is itself a form of power. Alauddin's legitimacy, that fragile, blood-stained thing he had been nursing since his uncle's assassination, consolidated around Kili, the way metal consolidates around a mould. He was the Sultan who had faced 60,000 Mongols and not blinked. The narrative of usurper, of murderer, of a man who took what was not his. It did not disappear because those things are true, and history does not forget them. But it was overlaid permanently by the narrative of the man who stood on the plain of Kili with his back to the Yamuna and held. The military reforms that Alauddin had implemented before the battle, the Dag branding system, the standing army funded directly by the state, the intelligence network of Barids and Munhis, the frontier fort construction, the price controls that prevented internal economic collapse during crisis, did not remain simply the administrative preferences of one sultan. They became the template. His successors and their successors operated within the military architecture Alauddin built. The standing army model in particular, the idea that a state's military power should be a direct function of centralized administrative capacity rather than the aggregated contributions of feudal nobles, outlasted the Khalji dynasty, outlasted the Tughlaqs who followed them, to influence the military thinking of every major power that ruled from Delhi for the next century. The long arc of consequence bends in a direction that Alauddin could not have anticipated and probably would not have cared about. The Mongols never conquered India. The Chagatai Khanate collapsed in the following century, fragmenting into successor states and eventually giving way to the Timurid tradition, the inheritors of the steppe, who came to India not as the storm Kutluk Khwaja represented, but as the dynasty that would eventually become the Mughals. The conquerors became the governed. The inheritors of Genghis Khan built mosques and gardens and miniature paintings in the cities their ancestors had tried to destroy. The world the Mongols wanted to unmake became the world that made them. But let us be precise about what Kili actually was, and why the title of this account frames it the way it does. The hidden weapon that defeated the Mongols at Kili was not the elephants, though the elephants mattered. It was not the terrain, though the terrain mattered. It was not Zafar Khan's charge, though Zafar Khan's charge and the wounds it opened in Kutluk Khwaja determined the outcome of the specific day. It was not even Alauddin's cold nerve in refusing to pursue, in holding his line while his most gifted general died without support. The hidden weapon was time. It was the years before the battle. It was the administrative decisions made in peacetime, the military reforms enacted when there was no immediate crisis requiring them, the intelligence networks built before there was any specific intelligence to gather, the fort at Siri constructed before there was any army to shelter in it. It was the recognition, rare among rulers in any era, then or now, that you do not defeat an army on the day of the battle. You defeat it in the years before it arrives. That is the lesson Kili carries across 7 centuries, not the glory of the charge, not the drama of the last stand, not the theatrical courage of the man who refuses terms and dies fighting. Those things happened and they deserve their place in the telling. But the reason they happened in a battle that Delhi survived, rather than in a battle that Delhi lost, is because a suspicious, paranoid, ruthless, brilliant man had spent 3 years building a system designed to make survival possible. Centuries later, the plain of Kili is South Delhi. Apartment blocks and arterial roads, and the noise of 10 million lives being lived simultaneously. The Yamuna, now one of the most polluted rivers in the world, still runs along the eastern edge of where the battle was fought, carrying its burden of the present southward without interest in the past. There is no monument to Zafar Khan in the vicinity of his death. There is no marker on the ground where Kutluk Khwaja's wound was dealt. Alauddin's tomb stands in the Qutb complex in Mehrauli, within the compound of the madrasa he built and never finished. Its dome long since collapsed, its walls pockmarked by 7 centuries of weather and indifference. Most tourists walk past it to reach the Qutb Minar, which is taller and more photogenic, and never know whose bones are nearby. The most consequential military mind in the history of the Delhi Sultanate lies in a half-ruined tomb that does not appear on most guide maps. History is like that. The greatest victories are not always the ones carved in stone, or named on monuments, or retold at ceremonies. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply the catastrophe that did not happen. The city that did not fall, the civilization that continued, the millions of ordinary lives, the nameless infantryman by the elephant lines, cleaning his sword, thinking of his wife, that went on being lived, because a system held on a cold plain in the winter of 1299. Kutluk Khwaja set out to end all of that. He brought 60,000 of the most feared warriors the world had ever produced. He marched 6 months with iron discipline and singular focus. He was patient and strategic and brave in the field. He was defeated by paperwork, by horse registries and grain prices and shadow informants and years of bureaucratic reform. He was defeated before he arrived. He simply did not know it yet. The greatest victories in history are rarely the ones that echo loudest. They are the ones that never had to be fought again.